Welcome back, everybody. My name is Jason. I'll be your host on this CFL talk show, Hussey's Huddle. In this video, I'm going to give my final thoughts on the 2021 CFL Draft with it now in the books a couple of days ago, and just give my thoughts on some of my favorite selections, some players that went earlier than expected, and some players that really fell in the draft, as well as my reactions to the early picks in the first round. But really quickly before we get started, I have a few announcements today. First is actually going to be a shout out to 3 Down Development, the YouTube channel. They do some really great stuff over there, guys. They run these coaching seminars where they break down Canadian football concepts and strategies, and they're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, so I'd really appreciate it if you went over there and sub to them as well. And then the other announcement is I want to apologize because in my last video I said that I was going to be doing a live draft stream, and it just didn't come to fruition just because it's a long story, but I was working that day and I had to rush home and just get there in time for the event, and I didn't know that you had to kind of verify your YouTube account 24 hours in advance to do your first live stream on a channel. And so there was just some things that I wasn't aware of, but no worries. There's going to be lots of live streams in the future on the channel, I promise you, and this is going to be a long video, but if you want to support the channel, the best way to do it is by hitting that like button and subscribing to Hussey's Huddle for more CFL content, just like this. And with that said, let's just dive in to the 2021 CFL Draft. So first I'm going to go over the top 10 picks of this year's draft. Like I said in my mock draft, I'm going to do the top 10 picks because Montreal didn't have a pick in the first round. I want to cover every team in at least some capacity. And I'm just going to give you my initial thoughts of what I thought of these picks the first time I saw them come across the screen and the commissioner announced the picks. So Jake Burke went number 1 overall to the Hamilton Tiger Cats. This was honestly pretty shocking, to say the least. But I think there are so many interesting ways in which Hamilton can deploy both Jake Burke and Nikola Kalinic, who was their second-round pick in 2019, who looked really good as a rookie as this kind of tight end fullback hybrid guy that actually had a little bit of receiving upside. So I'm fascinated to see their vision for him in this offense with those two guys. And they also took another fullback guy later on. So it's going to be interesting to see. They have all these different types of that kind of player on this Hamilton roster. And it's going to be interesting to see that they incorporate those pieces going forward. Moving on to number 2, the Saskatchewan Roughriders took Nelson Lacombo out of Saskatchewan. The Riders definitely needed depth in their secondary with their plans to start Mike Edam and potentially a second Canadian defensive back in Eli Buka. And so they really needed to shore up that secondary. They also needed to replace what Cameron Judge brought to the table, even though you're never going to replace what Cameron Judge really did bring to the table. You really needed to shore up that linebacker depth, and Lacombo kind of fulfills both purposes in this regard. He's kind of a guy I could see playing both linebacker and DB in some capacity in the CFL, and he's also comes with the benefit of being a Saskatchewan university product, an in-province local product for the fan base to really get engaged with, and this was just kind of a slam dunk pick. Now moving on to Winnipeg at number 3, I was surprised that the first offensive lineman off the board was a futures pick, because honestly Dobson is going to be a guy because he just transferred to Texas State. He has 1 year remaining of NCAA eligibility. He's going to go out his final year there, and Winnipeg's not going to see him probably not till 2022. But at the same time, I'm honestly not all that surprised about this because Dobson, at early points in this draft process, people were projecting where players would go. Many people had Dobson going number 1 until he entered the transfer portal. And it's going to be interesting to see if his stock really rises next year while at Texas State. Does he get a chance at the NFL? At number 4, the BC Lions took defensive end Daniel Joseph. And I'm stunned BC didn't go offensive line here, but I get that the team was very thin at defensive line as well. Personally, I wouldn't have done it just because I don't think it's all that likely that BC starts a Canadian at defensive line in the near future anyways, but it's always good to keep your options open as to where you want to start Canadian players going into the future for ratio flexibility in case you get injuries. You may not like backup that you have at a position you're starting a Canadian at. So it gives you that flexibility. Obviously, like I said, they were saying it all over the broadcast. They didn't really have any really good defensive line. And so Daniel Joseph, he's another guy that's not going to be here in 2021. He's going back to North Carolina State. But theoretically in 2022, as long as the NFL doesn't come calling, he's going to be a potential impact player as probably the best pass rusher in this draft. At number 5, this was really probably the biggest surprise to me in round 1, even though in the CFL draft it's not all that uncommon that teams take players from their home province like much earlier than you would think they would go. At the same time, the more I think about this pick of Cole Nelson to Edmonton makes a ton of sense because they're just building up this stable of Canadian defensive linemen with Kwaku Boateng, Matthew Betts, and now Nelson rounding out that group. Also, don't forget that they also drafted another defensive lineman, Elaine Pay, in the second round last year. So this is kind of a regular way of building a CFL team. You don't usually see a ton of impact defensive linemen who are Canadian in the CFL, besides a few standout names. But Edmonton's really taking this very contrary team building strategy, and I like it. At number 6, this was another surprise. We had linebacker Desean Stevens out of Maine, and Stevens is seen by some as an edge player, and it was a very interesting pick for the Red Blacks, and he's another one of these guys that is likely to arrive in 2022 rather than 2021. But Stevens has obvious upside and positional flexibility. Like I said, he likely slots in as Ottawa's number 2 Canadian defensive lineman come 2022, behind Cleon Lang, who's obviously the standout of that unit, because they do have Stephon Charles there, but he's getting up there in age, and I think it's pretty likely that by 2022 that he's off the roster and Stevens comes in and he slots in as their number 2 Canadian defensive lineman. He's able to contribute on special teams. He's a good enough athlete to do that. And so this pick, again, makes a lot of sense. At number 7, a lot of people thought a Calgary offensive lineman would be selected in the first round. I'm not too sure everybody thought it would be Pierre rather than Logan Bandy. Nicastro goes all the way here at number 7 to the Argos, and I love this pick again from a team perspective. I think Toronto, I think they were saying this all over the broadcast, that Toronto has easily the best Canadian talent in the league, and while I don't necessarily disagree with that, I think it's far from a flawless Canadian roster. I don't trust a lot of their offensive linemen, particularly Jamal Campbell. I don't think he's a starting caliber offensive tackle in the CFL. Nicastro provides some interior offensive line depth in an immediate sense, and I think the plan will probably be for him to start as early as 2022 if Philip Blake, who is now 35, parts ways with the team next offseason, which I think is pretty likely. And at number 8, again, another surprise. This was just a very shocking first round. Amin Ogbongbemiga out of Oklahoma State. I think I said it right this time. He goes really early in this draft, despite drawing a lot of NFL interest. He signed with, I'm blanking who he signed an undrafted free agent contract with, but his stock in the CFL draft rose rapidly after he was supposed to be selected in the NFL draft, but he went undrafted, and the perceived chances of coming to the CFL have increased dramatically because of that. Calgary's going to have to take the wait-and-see approach, but I think if he comes to the CFL, he's a potential star. He could prove to be the best player in this draft class. You know, I really understand the pick for Calgary. I think they could have went offensive line here with a lot of talented players on the board, but a lot of the guys that are available are futures picks this year that weren't going to come to the CFL right away anyway. So why not take a swing on a high upside player like Amin Ogbongbemiga? Now at number 9, the Hamilton Tiger Cats had their second first round pick. They took Nick Cross out of UBC. And like the Argos pick, this was not the UBC linebacker that everybody was expecting to go in the first round. Everybody thought Ben Hladek was going to be the number 1 linebacker taken in this draft, or one of the top 3 linebackers taken in this draft. But Nick Cross ends up going here at number 9 to Hamilton. They really like him. Apparently the big thing with him is just staying healthy. He's had a couple serious injuries, but Hamilton really likes his potential, obviously, to take him this high, and he's going to be a guy that comes to the CFL right away. It's kind of hard to argue until we see more of him going into the future here. in 2021. It's going to be interesting to see if he lives up to that high draft status after going a little bit earlier than people expected. Now at number 10, Montreal made probably the most predictable decision here at number 10 once we knew who was still on the board. They took Pierre, Olivier, Lestage out of Montreal, an offensive lineman. Everyone and their moms could have called this one as soon as Lestage was within reach of Danny Machocha with this selection. It's honestly a slam dunk selection if Lestage fails to stick in the NFL beyond this season and is able to join a very heavy French-Canadian contingent on the Als later in 2021 or in 2022 or beyond that if he still comes to the CFL. That is my recap of the first round. Now, here's the players that I thought went earlier than expected. Nick Cross, as we just talked about, went number 9 to the Tiger Cats. Cross really must have shot up draft boards for the Tiger Cats during the draft process, despite not even submitting drills for the virtual combine this year. He led the Thunderbirds in tackles in 2019 over fellow drafted linebacker Ben Hladek. However, because of Hladek's great performance in the combine, most expected him to easily go before Cross in the draft, but this was far from the case, with Hladek falling all the way to the top of the 3rd round, which was honestly just a shocker to me. I think a lot of people had him going in the top 5, including myself when I did the mock draft earlier this week. So Nick Cross, a little bit early in terms of people's projections, but doesn't mean it's a bad pick. We just need to see how it's going to pan out in the future, like all of these picks. Now, the second guy that I thought went a bit earlier than expected, or just the fact that he was drafted at all, and that's defensive back Benjamin St. Just out of Minnesota, who was a 3rd round pick of the Washington football team just last week. Not that being the 3rd to last pick in the draft is really going higher than expected, but this is more so the fact that St. Just was drafted in this year's class at all, considering he was taken, like I said, in the 3rd round of the NFL draft. I think he absolutely finds a role in the NFL long term just because of his size and length for a defensive back, which teams are coveting more and more with the increasing amount of uber athletic receivers coming into the league each year. So I don't think he necessarily comes to the CFL ever, but I think it's still worth the dart throw with the 3rd last pick of the draft for Toronto. Now, the final guy that went a little bit earlier than I thought was Crandy, going to Winnipeg at 16th overall out of the University of Montreal. This one isn't nearly as shocking, but Crandy jumped ahead of a lot of other players that many expected to go higher than him, including a guy like Patrice Rene, who was rated consistently high on the league's scouting bureau. It's clear to me that teams were not deterred to take youth sports prospects who remained in this class, despite them not taking the field in well over a year. I can see the advantages of taking a youth sports prospect this year, though, with those prospects in this year's draft essentially being the most surefire bets to be in training camps whenever they open this summer. Now, I'm going to move on to 3 players that fell in the draft, and this was a lot easier to put together because there's so many guys that were just expected to go much higher than they ended up going in this year's draft. My number 1 guy here is wide receiver Terrell Janna, who went to the Saskatchewan Roughriders with the 17th pick. This one really just goes to show you that trying to project the CFL draft this year was a fool's game. Some saw Janna going as high as the 1st pick in the draft to Hamilton, and he is seen as a near consensus 1st round pick by almost anyone, while not receiving much NFL interest following the NFL draft. So it was shocking to me that he lasted all the way to the end of round 2. But at the end of the day, it's a nice landing spot for him to get on the field early in his career. They do have a couple guys they've invested some draft capital in, like Justin McGinnis, and another guy that's slipping my tongue here, but I think that there's a path forward to Terrell Janna getting on the field within the first couple years of his career. And I'm really excited to see what he does after falling in the draft. Another guy, likewise, who I had projected really high in my mock draft, I had him going number 2 overall, and that's defensive lineman Mohamed Diallo out of Central Michigan. Another guy, everyone, including me, was projecting to go no later than the end of the 1st round, but alas, the league had different plans. Diallo easily looked like the best defensive tackle prospect in this class. However, he may have been hurt by the fact that he wouldn't be coming to the CFL until 2022 in all likelihood. His transfer history of switching to multiple schools, as I mentioned in my mock draft, also may have scared away teams to an extent, and the Tiger Cats in this case get a potential Ted Laurent replacement down the road in the years ahead if he sees the right development. And finally, the biggest drop I could think of in this year's class was offensive lineman Logan Bandy dropping all the way to the 5th round at the number 38 pick to the Saskatchewan Roughriders. Bandy clearly wasn't seen in the same light by CFL teams as he was by people that talked about the draft over the last several months. Marshall Ferguson, who I highly respect, had this guy going number 2 overall in his final mock draft, and even though he acknowledged himself that he might not go that high on draft day, I doubt anybody expected him to fall to round 5. This reminds me of the 2020 draft where Laval offensive lineman Ketel Esse was considered by many to be in the running for the number 1 pick, but somehow mysteriously fell to round 8, and I cannot honestly explain that for the life of me. I tell you, there's just some things about the CFL draft that are just impossible to explain to people. Finally, I'm going to move on to my favorite 3 picks in this year's draft, and it doesn't mean I didn't like other picks. It's just these are 3 guys that I was really high on going into the draft process, and I just really like the fits with these specific teams and what these teams did in finding them when they did in the draft. And the first guy is Kyle Borsa, running back out of Regina, who goes number 39 in the draft to Winnipeg. I wasn't high on taking the uber athletic running back super high in the draft, as some were suggesting. Some were saying take him in like the 2nd round. But him lasting all the way until round 5 was a bit surprising, given his crazy testing numbers at the combine. Winnipeg is the ideal fit for Borsa, who hasn't actually played since 2018 due to a suspension from PEDs in 2019. But like I said, he has incredible athleticism that you rarely see from a Canadian runner, especially one that's coming to the CFL. The Bombers know a thing or two about having a Canadian running back in their backfield, and with Andrew Harris getting up there in age, they now have a couple of very intriguing backup options in Borsa, Brady Olivier, and who's the other kid? The kid from Guelph that they still have on the roster. He looked really good. But another name that's just slipping my mind here. But we're moving on to my second favorite pick, and that is offensive lineman Alaric Jackson going to BC at number 15. This is just a gut feel, but I don't think Jackson sticks in the NFL, which means that it's a potentially big gain for the Lions here. I've been pounding the table for a while for the Lions to inject a high upside prospect into their offensive line talent pool, and Jackson would provide just that if he comes to the CFL, which could be as soon as 2022 if things don't work out this year in the NFL. In the meantime, BC can evaluate several unproven offensive linemen that they currently have on the roster that they've drafted over the past few years, like former first-round pick Peter Godber, while awaiting the potential arrival of the elite prospect Jackson down the road. And my third and final favorite selection of this draft was Toronto selecting Sage Dockstader, offensive lineman, number 12 overall in the 2nd round. Sorry if I'm boring everyone with all the offensive line talk, but I've long believed that the worst weakness to have on a football team outside of quarterback is a bad offensive line. And with that said, the Argos needed to beef up their young talent up front going into this draft, especially at tackle, where they really just have Jamal Campbell as a Canadian prospect there. They've been trying to develop him for years, and in 2019, his film was just terrible. Dockstader fits this bill in literally a massive way. He likely won't be coming to the CFL in 2021, instead returning for a 5th year at New Mexico State. However, that's perfectly fine for Toronto, who needs more long-term help anyway. And with that said, I would like to thank everyone for sticking with me through this very long video. I really couldn't do this any other way. I just wanted to get this recap all into one big video. And I would like to thank everyone for watching. Once again, my name is Jason. If you want to support the channel, the best way to do it is by hitting that like button and subscribing to Hussey's Huddle for more CFL content just like this. Be sure to let me know in the comments section what your favorite picks from this draft were. What kind of players do you think are going to be the biggest steals in this draft class? And with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Peace.